Hello, everyone. How was your weekend? Mine was exemplary. I had a cheeseburger last night, and that's how to get the week off to a start. Yeah, you'll hear me talk a lot about cheeseburgers in this class. I apologize if you're a vegetarian. It's not meant to be offensive. I grew up in the generation where McDonald's was king. Okay, and never quite got over that. Ironically, I don't eat McDonald's anymore, but still love cheeseburgers. All right, we have a lot to talk about today, so I want to go ahead and get started. First and foremost, these two kind of lead into one another, but I want to talk a little bit about the email that I sent out. This is just relevant for those of you who are first day complete. So I started doing some review, and I put the link in course materials that you should be able to access to be able to get your Connect course materials. Now, just for context, I said this before. I'm not putting any assignments in Connect. The only reason that you would need Connect for First Day Complete is to have access to the textbook because that's the ebook. Which if you click on this link right here, the way that the image shows me is that it should be actually show you that you get a register a code for Connect, and it should come up and say, "Hey, reveal the code so you can log into Connect." That's not what comes up. This comes up. Now I've emailed the person in charge, and she has not responded to me to actually fix this problem. I'm trying to do a workaround here, and I wanted to show you the workaround. This may or may not work. This is why I'm kind of leaning or reaching out to you. So if those of you who are in this situation need to check and make sure this works, I'm hoping it does. If it doesn't, I sincerely apologize. One of my biggest pet peeves in the world is when somebody's got a responsibility and they put that responsibility off to somebody else. That's what I feel has kind of been done to me here, is that Barnes and Noble's responsible for this, and they said no, it's Dr. Barnes who's responsible. But it's not your fault. I don't want to penalize anybody, so I did my best. Okay, I'm doing my best here to try to make sure. And if it's not good enough, I sincerely apologize. But let's just go ahead and check it, make sure. So basically what I did is this actually took a lot longer than you might think because I was struggling with it, trying to get access. As you'll notice, I got this link to Connect Access. And all this is this quote unquote a reading assignment that I put into Connect. 0 points. There's no reason for you to complete this. The only reason I put this in here is so that I'd have a link to Brightspace to connect. And assuming if you've got first day complete access, you should be able to click on connect. And basically what will come up is another link will open up and you'll see a reading assignment, and this opens the ebook for you. Okay, we'll always go to chapter 1, but from here you can navigate to anywhere in the ebook, which was the entire intention there. You do need to have access to the book because you need to be able to find out what your assignment is for the course and be able to access that information. Hopefully that works. If it doesn't work, I sincerely apologize. I will try my best. Like I said, I've got a pending email out to the Barnes and Noble representative or the bookstore manager to try to figure out what this is. But this is my best shot at this. If you're in a situation where you're trying to get this to work and you cannot get it to work, my best advice for you right now is reach out to somebody in the class who's not relying on the electronic information, or at least has access to a book of some type, and get a copy of the information for the homework. It's not particularly time consuming. It's not particularly difficult. That's kind of my best information. If that doesn't work out, if you're just really in a bind and cannot get access to the book, let me know and I'll try to work something out for you. But for context for this, I think I said this already. This was information that should have been provided to us 30 days before the start of the semester. It was not provided to us until last Tuesday. Okay. So I know it sounds like I'm trying to pass the blame onto somebody else, but I really honestly didn't know what was going on here. I thought, oh, first day complete. That sounds like a great idea, until all of a sudden it was like, all right, here's what you all have to do. And we were not told all the details. Yes.
First day, or get access to the code, right? After that purchase of the.
So yeah, what should happen is when you click on this link right here, the BNC First Day Materials, is this picture of the book should come up, and should say I have a link that provides the code for you, and that's what I was made to understand based on the instructions that I was given. Obviously, it says right here, the publisher delivers courseware to access our course content and navigate to the integration LMS, which is kind of problematic because I'm trying to integrate, because we can drop down assignments, but they always link back to Connect. So that's why I created the Connect course link. Again, if you're having problems with that, it's not working, what I would encourage you to do is reach out to the bookstore. I know that's probably not a good idea to flood the bookstore with information and say, okay, details, or give them details. But if they know it's a problem, then maybe they'll step up, because they have not responded to my emails yet, and I sent multiple. So again, I sincerely apologize for those of you who are in that boat, in that situation. I would not have put that burden upon you had I known any better, but I was kind of oblivious to this. I think that the first day complete is a great idea in concept. The execution is just a little bit off right now. So I will do my best to work with you so that you can get access to the content that you need for the homework on Wednesday. All right. That's my promise to you, is that I will do what I can, because even though I'm a little bit miffed at the bookstore right now, it's not my fair to push that responsibility off on you all. You all are just willing participants who are just kind of in a stuck between a rock and a hard place. I guess the rock being the bookstore and being the hard place. I don't know. That was a bad analogy. All right. So yeah, a bad analogy, bad analogy. Related to that, I don't want to talk about the homework. I did mention this on the first day of class, that my homework is completion based. And I want you to read into what that's supposed to mean. That basically means I want you to complete the homework. I don't want you to have the pressure of making sure that you get stuff right. That was always a concern to me, is that if I got a question wrong because I didn't know the content of the question, that I was going to be graded off. On one hand, having that pressure to actually make sure that you get the questions right does force you to work a little bit harder. On the other hand, it's kind of an undue stress, especially with complex technical content such as the stuff we're dealing with. So I do want to make sure you understand that when we're going through this, it's not just circle whatever answer you feel like circling arbitrarily. I do want you to try to make sure you get the correct answers as you're doing the homework, because remember, this is preparation for the exam, and I want to make sure that you're repeated exposure to this. If you're really just stuck and you just can't come with an answer, then that's I guess the last option, but that should never be your default, is just circle arbitrary answers on the multiple choice questions. As far as the short answer question goes, please make sure that you put sufficient content on the short answer development. Don't just write a few words and expect that to be enough. Very rarely will that be the case. I think for the first few short answer questions, they're actually pretty easy because they don't really require a lot of detail, a lot of exposure to go into. Some of them are just matching terms to other terms, which is really easy. But again, please make sure you put in a sufficient amount of work to learn the material, because ultimately it's not about whether or not you get full credit on the homework. It's about what your test score is going to be here in a few weeks when you get to that point. This is part of that development process for that. All right. Any questions before we get started on the content for today? All right. Anybody have any extra caffeine for today? Because I did warn you for today. This is going to be a little bit boring. Anybody take a little bit? I did. I took a little extra caffeine. I put an extra half scoop of coffee in my coffee today. It was dark and it was not delicious. It was very, very dank, but it's like I have to put creamer in my coffee because otherwise it's like drinking mud. So yeah, I'm a little bit hyped up. But today we're going to be talking about, basically, it says accountants as business analysts. I want you to read it, and this is saying this is our first part of documentation. Okay. And so a little bit of an introduction as to what we mean by context for this is that you need to understand how to interpret accounting information system data. And I've already alluded to this. Many of the people in this room, they're going to be accounting majors, are going to have some sort of accounting relationship, and that's great. I've looked through the quizzes, and for those of you who are going to be accountants, I look forward to that. I think it's a good place. That being said, those of you who are not accounting majors, whatever your major is, it's actually going to be good in development. You've got a future there as well. The ultimate objective, though, for this course is to make sure that you can read accounting information regardless of what your major is. Because regardless of what your major is, you're going to be using accounting information in your day-to-day work. It doesn't matter if you're going to be a finance professional, a marketing professional, a management professional, international business. Every single person is going to have to know how to look at this detail and understand what it means. So our goal today is to talk a little bit about the nature of documentation, accounting documentation, and how we prepare it. Now, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about documentation hierarchy so you can understand kind of the sequence that we're going to be working with. So we're going to start with business process, which is a little bit weird because we're not going to actually talk about specific business processes until we get to a few chapters from now. I believe it's chapter 7, 8, and 9. By the way, this question came up and I want to clarify. This is chapter 4. Originally in the old textbook, the one that was previous to the Versa textbook, this was chapter 2, which is why we're covering it second in this course in the semester. I still want to cover this as the second chapter in the course, but it is now chapter 4 in the textbook. They just reordered some of the chapters. So if you hear me refer to something as chapter 2 when I'm talking about the content in this chapter, that's a misnomer. It should actually all be chapter 4. I'm trying to make the updates, but I may miss something. So make sure you know that. So a business process: define a sequence of business activities to use resources to achieve business goals. We're going to talk about 3 specific business processes in this course. We're going to talk about the revenue process, which is called the sales and collection process in the book. We're going to talk about the purchasing process, which I believe is called purchase and procurement or something along those lines. And then we're going to talk about inventory management. And those are processes that are common to most organizations that we would be dealing with. So that's going to be our goal there is to actually see how everything sequences within those three process areas, because those are very common process areas. Then we're going to use business analysis to develop process requirements to evaluate potential improvements. Along with that, a business model is a simple abstract representation of one more business processes. So how do we read these next two bullet points? We are going to develop documentation so we can analyze and understand the steps that are inherent at every single one of our business processes. So our business processes are going to have multiple objectives, and we're going to be able to develop diagrams to represent what happens within those business process areas. Now, you probably already shorthand this to some degree already. If I were to ask somebody to say, can you explain to me what happens in the sales process? Do you feel pretty confident you could do a basic sales process? Says, yes, Dr. Barnes, I've gone to Taco Bell before. I know exactly how a sales process works. You think I'm joking, but that is a good example of how you would sequence a sales process, or the steps in buying a chalupa over Taco Bell. Okay, whatever it is that your item is. Okay. We're going to talk about that more in detail, and I probably will use Taco Bell as an example because that seems to be my go-to, despite the fact that I never eat a Taco Bell anymore. No McDonald's, no Taco Bell. It sucks getting old. Okay, but they do use the same sequence that we would assume being inherent in all types of business models of that. So our goal is to actually use documentation to explain how business process and systems operate. Now, this is going to be our starting point for this chapter, and I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. We're going to talk about different types of documentation, but we're going to focus on one in particular, and we'll talk about when we get to that here in just a second. But let's go ahead and talk a little bit about what the goal is for our next couple of chapters. So you'll notice we talk about business process models and our business rules. In between there come in two types of models. We have activity models and structure models. Activity models are the focus of this chapter, and structure models are the focus of chapter 5. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, if you think what we're doing today is boring and tedious, next week is going to be a whole new level of misery for you, okay? We're going to be doing unified model language diagrams, and let me tell you, I have never received a positive comment on that. I've never received a student say, I really love UML diagrams, Dr. Barnes. I hope to do this for my career. If you're one of those rare students that comes into that, it's great. Now, why do I do it if people hate it? Because it's really important to understand how sequences operate, all right? So am I going to force you to do something that you're going to be miserable doing? Probably so. I'm not going to do a lot of it, but I do think it's important to discuss these concepts. Activity models and structure models are distinct in the way that we approach them. So activity models are going to be what we talk about today. The way you should think about activity models is this is interpretation of business processes the way that we would think about it from a human perspective, how a human would interpret business process activities. When we get into structure models, this is how a computer would interpret business processes. And there's an important distinction there because the sequencing is going to be very, very distinct, okay? We're going to have to actually make sure we understand what goes into what spot and how we actually categorize this information. It is not difficult, but if you don't spend enough effort on learning the basics, it can be a challenge to actually make sure you put everything in the proper spot. I'm going to try to simplify it as much as possible, and we're only going to be operating at a very basic level. Trust me when I say that the information that we're covering today, even though some of it may look really challenging, it can get a lot worse, a lot more detailed. When you get to a big level business, if you dealt like Amazon or Walmart, probably their diagramming processes are going to be off the charts ridiculous, okay, simply because of all the interactions that occur. We're going to be keeping it pretty simple, pretty straightforward. All right, so why do we document? Why do we document? There are going to be 4 paramount reasons for documentation. First of all, we want to promote organizational efficiency. We want to optimize our service and production with minimal inputs. Now, efficiency is really important simply because if you try to overwhelm people with information, they're just going to tune you out. Has anybody ever heard the term information overload? It's a real problem in this day and age. There's a lot of detail that needs to be that could be shared out there. Not all of it's necessarily relevant. So our primary goal, I would say it's fair to say that our primary goal is to try to convey information with the minimal amount of inputs necessary. We're going to try to keep it as simple as possible, if not simpler. Einstein said that, not really, but I like to attribute it and make sure Einstein said that. All right. So we're going to start with efficiency. Along with efficiency, we want to be effective, okay? We want to be effective in our communication. Now, it's great to be efficient, but if you do not provide enough context, it's hard to make decisions. I would love to have a 5-sentence syllabus. Has anybody looked at that syllabus, by the way? It's ridiculous, isn't it? Every single year I try to make that syllabus shorter, and it just keeps getting longer and longer and longer as I keep having to add content to it. So that is a simple version. That is a simple version of a summary of this particular course, and it's ridiculous. It's ridiculously long because I have to achieve some level of effectiveness. So there's going to be kind of opposing forces there. While we would like to be efficient, we also have to be effective. So those are going to be constraints against one another. We want to make sure we obtain the expected service and production output. Next, something we've already talked about, we want to make sure we properly design and operate internal controls. All right. We've heard that term controls. What is control again? We talked about this on Wednesday, I think. I gave you a basic definition of control. It's a response to a risk. Very good. Okay. So organizations are subjects to nature or to basic risks through external stimuli or internal operations. We want to make sure we address those properly. So controls are responses to risks, and we have to make sure we have those in place. Going to be a big focus of this course, so we want to make sure we start that in place. And then also related to that, want to make sure we have proper compliance with relevant laws and regulations. Unless you're operating in an industry that's not sanctioned legal by the federal government, you go back to prohibition in the 1920s when they had the people who were making alcohol and selling alcohol. It's probably not a good line of business or good idea to break the law out there. So we want to make sure we comply with the relevant laws and regulations. Okay, make sure that we're following the rules of the industry they operate within. What are some other things that we can actually associate? So those are the big four, by the way. Those are the four that I would expect you to know for the exam. Okay. Efficiency, effectiveness, internal controls, and compliance. That's basically all that you need to know. You notice I underlined specific words in each of those. Make sure you know those words with respect to the purposes of documentation. But there's some other purposes we could talk about. Talk about employee training, okay? We want to make sure documentation so people know their role. Has anybody ever done a job where you had to do employee training and you're just kind of like, this is the biggest waste of time? Trust me when I say that this is not over, okay? They're probably not going to make employee training more efficient. I'm terrible. I was terrible at employee training. I'm still terrible at employee training. I'm one of those people that gets like 5 minutes in and then I tune out and say, oh, what's for lunch today, or what's for dinner tonight, or what am I to be doing this weekend? So yeah, I recognize that, but I also recognize the importance of training. There's important to be able to communicate information to update and to be able to actually make sure that we know what our job is, particularly given the light of the surrounding environment, because things may change over time. Audit requirements. We have people who come in and make sure that the place is operating correctly. So we want to make sure that we understand what it is required of them. So when the auditors come in, we can actually meet what their requests are. Some tax professors who are going to go nameless here may tell you never trust an auditor. But you do have to actually do what the auditor asks you to do, even if you don't trust them. Accountability, make sure that we're responsible for what it is that we have to accomplish. And internal communication, external to the stakeholders outside of the organization, and internal communication to the managers and stakeholders within the organization. Those are all things that are going to be very, very paramount in that regard. Now, let's go ahead and talk about the nature of documentation. The nature of documentation is basically going to consist of two, and you notice I put in complementary types. So what are those two types? First is my favorite. This is narrative descriptions, okay? Because I tend to operate much more effectively via the spoken word or the written word. So narrative descriptions basically describe what is happening in a particular operation. Then we have graphical representations, and there's 4 different types that we could talk about. In fact, we are going to talk about them to differing degrees. We're going to be talking about block diagrams, data flow diagrams, flow charts, and then business process models. Now, we're going to focus very heavily on the latter, the business process model. In fact, our discussion of this course is going to be on BPMN, business process model notation. And you're going to be making BPMN diagrams, which sounds really, really daunting, but it's actually not. It's not that difficult at all. Even though they are the most detailed, they're somewhat abstract in their focus and their form. So we could talk about them from being least detailed to most detailed. This is not the most detailed and the most complex of the diagramming, but the detail that they show within the process themselves, okay? I would actually argue the flowcharts are more detailed in execution, but they're less detailed in the information they represent. All right, so why do we have documentation? Well, let's just use a pretty basic example. So as technology has evolved, the nature of process and system documentation has changed to match pace, okay? So as technology has gotten more complex and more ornate, we've had to increase documentation to match that. So let's consider the following. What is this thing right here? Has anybody ever seen one of those? It's a tablet. Specifically, it's an iPad, okay? If you've ever operated on those, you know the iPad, okay? Then if we go back, let's say 40 years, has anybody ever operated on one of those? Has anybody even seen a floppy disk before? Yeah. So that save button that you see on top of the Windows screen, you notice it's a symbol. It's like, what is that symbol? That is so weird. That symbol, that save button symbol, actually represents saving on one of these computers. This is an IBM PC 5150. It's like circa 1986. Okay. Which everybody says that was so far before I was born. I was like, I was 14 in 1986. So yeah, I was using one of these computers actively. They didn't have a hard drive. I remember when we actually got a hard drive in my home computer. It was 1989. My dad installed a hard drive in our home computer, monochrome. It was portable, technically speaking, meaning you could pick it up, but it was like 40 pounds. And so I remember him saying, "You're gonna love this. You're gonna love this." We got a 40 megabyte hard drive, and he said, "I don't know what we're gonna do with all this space. All 40 megabytes of it." Okay. My, how things have changed now. 40 megabytes, you couldn't even write you can write a text in 40 megabytes anymore almost. I guess that's not true. It's I'm being facetious. But now everybody's just kind of like, okay, I've got terabytes of storage in my computer, Dr. Barnes. It's like, yeah, look at you 40 years later. Yeah. All right. So IBM PC 50. Could we go back even further? What if we go back to the 60s and the Columbia punch card computer? This is a picture in black and white. This is the image was originally taken in black and white. So in order to be able to program one of those computers, you had to actually use literal pieces of paper with punches in it, and you had to program it that way. You couldn't have a keyboard. There was no graphical. There was no monitor. It was putting information into the keyboard. Okay. I suppose we can go back even further. We can go like the Turing machines back in the 1940s. You know, has anybody seen The Imitation Game? Good movie, by the way. I recommend it. Okay. But yeah. So what do we know about these devices? Which of these are probably the easiest to use? If I were to say, all right, I want you to do the rest of your work this semester on one of these, which would be unfair, by the way, would be unfair. But if I said one to the work onto this, which one would you probably choose if you had to do your work on one of these devices? Probably the iPad, right? Easiest to use. It's got very, very simplistic user graphical interface. If you really wanted to, you could actually pull out an iPen and you could write down your notes just like that, and you could transition to them. If your handwriting is good, it will actually transfer them into text characters, which I can't do that because my handwriting sucks. You know, but yeah, that would be kind of an option there. And then using these other ones are a little bit more challenging. So there's an interesting paradox there, because if I were to say which of these are probably the most simplistic in nature, as far as the machines themselves, probably the Columbia punch card computer too, or computer is, right? That one's one of those ones that's got very, very basic mechanisms in place because the technology at the time was not nearly as advanced as it is now. So there's an interesting dichotomy there. As technological complexity becomes stronger, the ability of users to use the device is easier. So the technology is better here, which means easier use. There's a little bit of a trade-off there. How easy do you think it would be to fix one of these Columbia punch card computers? Probably not easy, but much easier than to fix an iPad. Could anybody say they could fix an iPad if they had to? Like go in to fix the microchips, do the welding back and then microchips in place and just go in? Probably not. Probably not. Okay. The technology itself is complex, meaning the documentation associated with the technology is going to be necessarily complex as well. So when you think about it, keep in mind that written description of the components, flows, and other processes with the system. When we think about this, keep in mind that part of the reason that the nature of descriptions has become so much more complex is because the technology has evolved to the point that it's necessary to be able to describe it at a very detailed level. So even though computers are much easier to use than they were 50, 60 years ago, the technology itself is a lot more complex. All right, I kind of got ahead of myself. So let's talk about narrow descriptions. These are exactly what they sound like, okay? So written description of the computer's flows, another process, component's flows, another process within the system. So basically you write down what's going on within the process area. The good news is that these are very detailed and focused. The bad news is they're hard to follow. Most people are visual thinkers and they don't like trying to visualize something looking at a paragraph, all right? So with narrative descriptions, I will say that they're a necessary component of documentation, but they are generally used in unison with graphical representations. How many people would think of themselves as visual thinkers in this classroom? Like if I gave you the option of looking at a narrative description versus a flow chart, how many people would say, I'd like the flow chart, Dr. Barnes? Probably most of everybody in this class, okay? I'm one of those rare exceptions to say I just hate flowcharts, which is probably awful that I'm teaching this class and that's the case. But that being said, we make do with what we've got. All right, so what's our first graphical representation? So we're going to be dealing with a block diagram. And this is just a sounds, this is a series of blocks. This is kind of an early iteration of how we actually represent accounting and its subsystems. So you got to see here, we deal with the revenue process. We've actually got the subsets of the revenue process, and that's basically it. Not very detailed at all. It is pretty straightforward to interpret, but it doesn't provide a lot of explanation of what happens within the process areas. So this is our basic level. In series of rectangles just by themselves doesn't provide a lot of detail. Now you're gonna say, well, we're probably gonna have a whole lot more symbols, and that's gonna make things more complex. Trust me when I say that we're gonna have a reversion here pretty heavily. When we get to BPMN, you're gonna say, well, Dr. Barnes, that looks a lot like block diagrams. I say, yeah, but just wait. Okay. So we're going to expand it a little bit. We're going to go into data flow diagrams. Now, data flow diagrams give us a few additional symbols. Okay. We get the blocks, but we also get some circles that represent processes. We also get data stores and data flows. Now, these are going to represent some of the information of the inputs that we want to note. So inputs and outputs are going to be kind of data sources. Then we're going to have processing symbols and storage symbols, and then flows of information between these, which is really all you need for any system. As we're going to see when we get into flow charting, there are basically 5 different mechanisms in play. There's input and output, there's processing, there's storage, and then there's flows. And these are all contained within a data flow diagram. So as we can see here, we can actually look at the cash receipt system within a data flow diagram. This is actually a subset of one of the business process areas we just looked at. And it provides a lot more detail than just a block, just a rectangle. Shows who the entities are. It shows where the information is flowing and what the purpose of the information flows are. So if I were to actually say, which would you represent for the cash receipt system, which provides more detail, this block right here, or this right here, I think we can obviously say this is going to be a better depiction of the system itself. Even then, we could actually say that this is probably very simplified. It is a very simplified process. For some people, this may be sufficient. For other individuals, who may say, I need to know more about the entities. I need to know more about the flows. I need to know more about the specific processes and the mechanisms that are at play here. That is where flowcharts come in, and you're probably fairly familiar with the term flowcharts, okay? Flowcharts is a graphical representation of a system that provides a highly detailed view of a system's components and processes. It usually is going to be one of those that's very heavily used by accountants, and it follows an if-then format, which if-then format only means that if something happens, then this is the response. All right, so one spot is put into place, and if something transaction or event occurs, then we move on to the next item. Sometimes there can be multiple decision points. There can be decision trees where we actually move to multiple points, but for the most part, it's fairly intuitive because it follows the flow of what we expect to happen. Shows what the processes are, not what they should be, and there's actually governance of flow charting standards, which are pretty much outdated by now because there's a lot of symbols that we could actually associate with the flow charting standards that are not really relevant. For example, if we look at the flow charting symbols, these are kind of standard notation for flow charting symbols. You will notice in here we've got this thing for storage, and it's magnetic tape storage. Okay, first of all, it specifically says magnetic tape storage, not magnetic storage. Okay, it's an old symbol. Magnetic tape has not been used actively probably in 3 decades. And even then, if we're talking about just basic magnetic storage, many computers operate without magnetic storage nowadays. So this is kind of an old representation. That being said, it's still a good depiction of how we would use flowcharts in the process. Now, just so you know, this is for your own personal reference. I am not going to test you on flow charting symbols. I am not a monster, okay? But I do think it's important to kind of see the distinction between what we see for data flow diagrams and what we see for flowcharts. So we can actually break down a little bit more of the cash receipts system if we go here. Now you will notice this is a lot more complex and detailed than our data flow diagrams. But this is necessarily detailed for a few reasons. Is because, first of all, it's intended to be integrated with other business process areas. This shows us the details of one business process area, but it's going to be as it represents other business process systems. So what happens in a cash receipt? So everybody knows the term cash receipts. When do we receive cash most of the time as an organization? When a customer pays us? Why would a customer pay us? Because they bought something from us. So we're talking about the in part of a revenue transaction. So what would happen before cash receipts? You would send inventory into a customer. And so we probably got another part of the system that represents the inventory delivery, the inventory creation or delivery to customers. Whatever it is, the shipment, all of that takes place before this. And this depicts a point in the system where we actually know, a point in the process where we know what's going to happen. And there's some interesting things to be noting here. So first of all, it talks about the documents that are associated here, like a customer check or remittance advice that are associated with that. That term is used bandied about a lot. Has anybody heard the term remittance advice? It's really, really strange because it used to be very obvious to talk about remittance advices. Everybody would say, I know exactly what you're talking about, Dr. Barnes. I've seen it before. But most of our payments are electronic now. So I'm gonna ask you, have you ever seen a bill that's been sent by paper? Has anybody ever seen a bill sent by paper? Hopefully at least one person nods their head, okay? So in the bills that are sent by paper, usually there's something you can tear off on the bottom that says, okay, send this in with your payment. That is a remittance advice. And the idea being is that we want to be able to match what we're expected to be paid and what is actually paid. Those two numbers should match. That's the goal of a remittance advice. And you can see here, it actually says, do the documents match? Okay, the remittance advice and the payment. We want to make sure that those match. If they're not, we need to actually understand the distinction for that. So we go through the entities and the processes. It actually flows through the system. We've actually got an item here that looks like a can, okay? That's actually a storage point. By the way, this is an important point to note. What is storage? What is the purpose of storage? We tend to think of storage as kind of a given. Everybody has kind of had storage in place in their memories. Ever since you use a computer, it says, oh, this is going to be available for me at some point in the future. Has anybody ever saved a spreadsheet or saved a Word document on the computer? Okay. What is the purpose of saving it? Why don't you just go ahead and create whatever it is you want? It says, I got my thoughts out on paper and then delete it. Yeah, to reference it later, okay? There's usually going to be a difference in the point in time from which you create something or when something is derived to the point that it's utilized. Think about a transaction, all right? When is a transaction going to hit the systems and like in a accounting context? Well, you got the transaction creation, in this case, a cash receipt, and the cash receipt will be recognized on the financial statements. Are those days necessarily the same date? No, the cash receipt is going to occur before the financial statement recognition date. So we want to record the transaction and then be able to pull up the history of that transaction for some sort of later reference. That is the entire purpose of storage, by the way, is to accommodate timing differences. Now, I will say that was the original intended purpose of storage. Can we expand that definition in today's day and age? Can we actually say data mining is an important purpose of storage as well? Does everybody know what data mining is? So when you use large volumes of data, actually see trends in the population and make extrapolations about what's going on with that population. Yeah, if we have lots and lots of stored data, then we can utilize that for other purposes as well. Some may say nefarious purposes, but I'll let that judgment be reserved for later. Okay. So storage, and then we're going to have the outputs that are going to occur down here. Now, I don't want you to memorize this right here. This is a good example of how complex things can get. And by the way, when I say that BPMN is more complex, that is a true statement, but an inaccurate statement at the same time. We'll see why here in just a bit. What I would like you to remember is that when we think about data processing cycles within any diagram, it's going to consist of multiple steps. And there are 5 distinct, or technically 4, but I'm going to include a 5th one as well. There's going to be the capture or the data input, which we've talked about already. Also, you can probably add in at the end, there's going to be the output. In the middle of that, there's going to be the processing. Okay, processing is changing input into output. And then we also going to include that storage step, that accommodate the timing differences between when the input received and when the output needs to be utilized. All right. So this is a little bit of an expansion of what we talked about already in chapter 1, but a necessary expansion because this is how we characterize our data flow, our diagramming processes. There's another symbol which we're going to include here, which is called the flow. This is just the movement of information from one point to another, or data from one point to another. Okay, so there's actually a sequence. So I used to call this the IPSO framework, IPSO. I think you should remember IPSO, but also remember flows that are included in that as well. Those are going to be common to kind of all of our diagram processes that we're going to look at. The only one where that might not be the case is our original one, block diagrams, because block diagrams are so very generic and very abstract. All right, now we're going to talk about business process model notation, and this is the one we are going to focus on for this course. So this was first issued and adopted in 2004, so it's roughly the same age as you guys, okay? Your contemporaries with business process model notation. This is your generation's documentation source, all right? So it's maintained by the object management group, which I normally wouldn't focus too much on that. The only problem is the only reason I mention this is that our other form of documentation that we're going to talk about, UML diagramming, is also maintained by the object management group. So I wanted to give you the name of the organization that you send your hate mail to. All right. That was my goal here. So it represents an upgrade to traditional flowcharting to encompass more complex and modern business processes and systems. Now you may say, Dr. Barnes, I don't know if I want an upgrade to this right here. All right. When I say an upgrade, I mean this in a good way. It is at the same time more detailed and abstract at the same simultaneously. Because one of the problems with this particular diagram right here is it is mostly self-contained. It only shows what is going on within one part of the system. As accountants and as business people, we are going to be concerned with the system in its entirety. So we want to be able to take a much bigger view. This does not allow that. This says, okay, I'm going to look at individual steps within a sub-process, but I want to see the whole business process, the entirety of it. So business process model notation allows us to do that in a much more effective manner. And a general uses specialized modeling software. We're going to be limited on the number of symbols that we're going to be using, so it's going to be very easy to do it by hand. Or if you really want to get fancy, you can actually use the symbols that are available in Word or in Excel if you really want to create those. The only reason I mention this is you will have to create some BPMN diagrams for homework, which may create some problems because if you don't want to go through the hassle of trying to actually create these in electronic form, you can write them down. It's not particularly difficult to do. But if you're one of those experts of Visio, then you probably can do this very, very easy. If you've ever used Microsoft Visio, I've used it a few times. Generally speaking, it's not worth the hassle. I would just recommend that you just want to do this by hand because that's how you're going to do it on the exam. All right, so business process modelization. There are a few elements that we're going to be very focused on, okay? The first element is going to be an event, okay? Events include start, intermediate, and end events. So something that occurs to start the process, whatever includes to end the process, and events that occur in the middle that usually represent points of conjecture, all right? Whether this be a decision or whether this be something that's going to be we expect before we can move on to another part of the process. You notice that the intermediate events actually says they affect the flow of the process, but they do not start or end the process. So anything that occurs in the middle that we have to wait on. Events, pretty straightforward. We can actually dictate those. I think it's pretty obvious when we talk about events what those represent. Next are going to be activities. These are going to be the majority of our BPMN diagrams. I'd say the activities are going to represent what the main focus of the BPMN diagrams. These are specific steps in the business process. Basic activities are modeled as rounded rectangles. Now I'm going to make a note. If you write just regular rectangles without the rounded corners, I won't count off. Okay, that's fine. Okay, because I know rounding those rectangles can be a challenge. It can be difficult. Each activity is described with a short verb phrase. All right, and this is kind of a basic one. Trust me when I say that we'll get better details than do something. We'll get into a lot more detail in that regard. But this is just a sequence of rounded rectangles that kind of show what happens in a business process. Also, we're going to have our flows again, the sequence flows. Those are just arrows that show steps going from point to point. Now, it's important to note, this is going from left to right. Generally speaking, for horizontal representation, we rarely go from right to left. It can happen, especially if, like, say, we have to go back to a step. So, like, say, for example, we're doing a manufacturing process. We get to the end of the manufacturing process and something is broken, we have to go back and fix it, okay? So it is possible to go back. For the most part, horizontal representation will go from left to right. 90 to 95% of our representations will do that. We also have vertical representation that represents flows between departments and entities. Those can go in either direction, up, down, or down, up, okay? But sequence flows can move in multiple directions. I suppose technically speaking, we could say they could move diagonally or some other direction as well. But for the most part, we're going to try to keep them consistent with directions on a horizontal and vertical axis. Then one of my favorite things to talk about, gateways. Gateways show branching and process branching and merging as a result of decisions. So if you have a decision to make, you have a gateway, okay? Now, they often appear as pairs and diagrams. This is the big point of contention I make with the book, okay? I think every single gateway should have a beginning gateway and an ending gateway. You should actually have a beginning of decision and a resolution of the decision. Some of the diagrams in the book, they will show good, complete gateway diagrams. They will actually show a beginning and ending decision points. When we start getting later on in their shorthand notation, they usually show the beginning of the first gateway and they don't show the closing gateway. which me as an OCD individual makes me really, really antsy, okay, when you don't have a closing gateway. That being said, for shorthand purposes, if you have just a single gateway, that is fine, okay? You do not need to represent the full gateway. I do think that most gateways should have closing or opening and closing decisions, but that's just me. That's my preferences. What type of gateways can we have? Okay. Well, this is a handy guide to show what the different types of gateways are. I will say that most of our decisions are going to focus on this one. And you don't really need to put the X in it unless you feel like it. We're just going to talk about a blank gateway. There's an exclusive gateway. There's only one path out of the gateway and for each instance of a process. Now, we also have inclusive gateways. There can be one or more paths of the gateway, okay? And so it's basically if you have multiple decision points. Or we have parallel gateways, which all paths are taken out of the gateway and for each instance of a process. So you actually have to go through every single path, not just a single path. Any possible decision, all those decisions have to be made. So let's just look at some examples, okay? So you plan a trip, okay? You're going to take a trip. How are you going to travel? You're either going to take a flight or you're going to take a car, okay? If you're taking a flight, you have to reserve your flight. You have to buy or reserve your ticket on the airplane. If you're going to take a car, you have to reserve your rental car. You're not going to do both. You're going to do one or the other. That's an exclusive gateway, all right? An inclusive gateway. So once you get to wherever you're traveling, you're going to rent a car. So you're going to fly to your destination, and then you're going to rent a car. Has anybody ever done that where they had to travel to some place, then also rent a car to travel? So that would be an example of an inclusive gateway. So you travel to Boston. I say that because I traveled to Boston over the summer. And then you go to at the airport, you go to the rental car counter and you get your car. You have to reserve your flight and reserve a car. That's the example of the inclusive gateway. The parallel gateway, it requires reservations for all three, okay? So you plan your trip, you need a hotel, a flight, and a rental car. All of these have to be taking place. If you fail to do any of these, you're going to have a bad time of your trip, okay? If you show up in Boston with your rental car and drive to the hotel and realize you didn't make reservations, you're going to be very, very hectically trying to find a new hotel. That actually did not happen to me, but that's because I'm paranoid of something like that actually happening to me. So usually when I make reservations, I usually make reservations, then triple check them. Okay. Which is a terrible way to live your life, by the way. Don't live as I do. Don't live as I do. Make reservations, but don't triple check them. That's all I'm going to say. So here's an simple example of how we actually represent a BPMN and diagram. Okay. So this is a payment transaction. So we're going to actually start the transaction and say, all right, we want to purchase some items. So the customer comes in, they provide the items, we scan the items on the counter. Once the items are scanned, we actually determine payment method. There's two types of payment methods. There's a credit card or a cash. This you'll notice is an exclusive gateway, which is why we don't actually have a circle or a plus in here. It's either credit card or cash. We don't pay with both. So whichever one we do, we process what that transaction and that. We close our gateway and then we bag the items. And then once the items are bagged, the customer's free to take them home. Okay. Starting event, ending event, the activities that take place during that, and our decision point here. That's really all there is to that. Now, just for context, if I go back here, I'm going to scroll back really quickly. Would you prefer to learn this or this right here? What's your preference? Anybody really, really want to rally for flowcharts right here? I got some extra work if that's the case, okay? Now, this is a pretty basic process, and it doesn't get that much more complex than this, all right? There are a few caveats that I need to throw in here that you do need to be aware of, though, all right? This is going to be a good basic diagram. When we get to our business process model notation for our business processes themselves, once we get to revenues and purchasing, this is going to be kind of the guideline that we use. It's very simple and straightforward, all right? But there are a few things that we can add on to this. First of all, this is self-contained. It takes place within one process area or process sub area. This is actually the purchasing transaction like within a grocery store or something like that. Do you think that that's a good representation of an entire organization's business model? Like if I go to Walmart, this represents buying groceries. Does Walmart do more than buying groceries? Yeah, they have to purchase their own items. They have to actually pay their labor. They have to clean the store. They've got a lot of business processes contained within that. Also, this actually only represents one individual. This represents the person who's actually handling the transaction itself. We have a customer on the other end that's got their own set of decisions that are taking place as well. So we've got other departments within the same process, and we've got other entities as well. So we're going to be talking within the context of this as pools and lanes, okay? To make these diagrams over by pools and lanes. So anybody been swimming in a swimming pool that's got lanes in those? Okay. The way you think about this is if you are in a single pool with multiple lanes. The lanes themselves represent different departments within that business area, okay? So you're in this lane right here. This lane right here represents a different department. This one's department. So this is purchasing, this is receiving, this is cash receipts or cash collections, all right? All of these are going to represent different process areas within the same same entity. If we're in a completely different pool, that's a completely different entity. So we're here at Truman State. We could say, all right, Truman State's going to get some pizza from Domino's because my AS students are awesome. Okay, so Truman State is one entity. Domino's is a completely different entity. They'd be a different pool altogether. So that's how we characterize pools and lanes. So you can kind of see here the same pool right here. Lane 1, lane 2. These are two different departments. Okay, there can be sequence flows within this across these lanes. How does this happen? Well, think about this. You're in a business that's trying to do a credit-based sales system. So remember we talked about accrual-based accounting, and we said that usually involves extending credit to customers. So you're a salesperson. You say, I've got a new person I'm going to actually sell to. What is one of the very first things that you as a salesperson are going to do? You're going to reach out to your credit approval department and say, I need a credit approval check on this particular individual. So you in sales over here are going to say, I want to move over to this lane, or I want to send a process over to this lane, and they're going to do their activities before I commence mine. So they're going to do their credit checks in their different department. It's a necessary step to do because we don't want to be making sales to customers who are never going to pay us back or never going to send us the cash. It's also important to note that this crosses departmental lanes. These crosses lanes within the BPN diagram. That's a very simplified version of that. You notice this is a simplified version of this, but that's an example of where we would cross lanes or cross departments within an organization. A few more things we want to talk about. So first of all, simple communication is going to be represented by a single unbroken line. So if we got lane department communication across departments or communication within department, you'll notice that the arrow is unbroken, okay? When you see a dashed arrow, a broken arrow like this, this actually represents communications across entities or across pools. So there's a little bit of a distinction there when we actually start looking at cross-pool communication. So that would be an example of that, okay? You got a patient in a doctor's office, their communications that are occurring, requesting an appointment, and then signing the appointments. Those are communications that occur across entities. They're represented by the same sequence flow, except the sequence flow is dotted. Also, we're not going to encounter that in this chapter, but we're also going to see some subtle distinguishing characteristics, some subtle symbols that are going to come up, especially when we start getting into the more complex BPMN diagrams. These are not meant to confuse, but I do think it's important to have reference to this. So this is exhibit 414 on page 188 in the textbook. All right. Two of the ones that I think you should make sure you're very aware of, are the intermediate timer event and an intermediate error event. These are basically saying we're going to check something, and if everything's fine, we can move on with our process. But if everything needs to stop, like whether it's not the right time to actually move forward, or there's some condition that creates a problem, these are going to be symbols that we use to represent those particular situations. All right. How do you all feel about documentation now? Ready to head for the hills, saying that I made a bad career choice. All right. So I've got good news and bad news for you. The bad news is that business process and systems continue to expand, so they're not going anywhere. It doesn't really matter if you what line of business you go in, you're going to have to be able to deal with this. Trust me when I say that this is not particularly difficult, but it can be a little bit time consuming and tedious. All right. And regardless of your role, you'll be able to need to analyze these narratives and diagrams. This will be true for this chapter, and it will be true for the next chapter as well. So that's the bad news. The good news is that documentation has become more detailed. The tools to develop documentation has been evolved. So it's not going to be as difficult as you might think. You're not going to spend your days writing out BPMN diagrams or UML diagrams. There are going to be people who are going to be able to actually make these diagrams very effectively and very efficiently for your use. And the last piece of good news, if anybody was just sitting in this room, just kind of like, my gosh, this is so interesting. I can't wait for next week when we get to do more diagrams. You got a bright career ahead of you, okay? Bright career ahead of you. All right, have a good day. Homework on Wednesday as well as NetSuite. See you all then.
By end of day Wednesday or?
Before class on Wednesday. The homework is due before class we'll do the NetSuite assignment in class.